For scraps of love. My daughter texted me a recipe for peach pie. Underneath it, 6 numbers. That was the only warning I needed to drive through the rain toward a house where a man was about to learn exactly who he married into. My name is Thomas Reyes. I am 67 years old, begging for scraps of love. For 31 years, I served in naval special warfare, most of that time in places I still don't talk about at dinner tables. I retired to a quiet fishing town on the Georgia coast, the kind of place where the mail carrier knows your dog's name before she knows yours. Of begging for scraps of love. Folks around here see an old man in a faded ball cap buying bait at the marina, fixing his neighbor's dock railing for free, sitting alone at the diner counter on Tuesday mornings with black coffee in the newspaper. That's the whole story they know. That's the whole story I wanted them to know. My wife, Mary Ann, died of ovarian cancer 9 years ago. After that, my daughter Claire was the only thing left standing in my life that mattered more than silence. When she brought home a man named Marcus Whitfield 3 years later, smiling in a way I hadn't seen since before her mother got sick, for scraps of love, I told myself I owed it to her happiness to give him a fair chance. I told myself a lot of things back then. Most of them were wrong. Marcus sold luxury boats out of a glass-fronted dealership 40 minutes up the coast for scraps of love, the kind of place with a fountain in the lobby and a wall of framed magazine features nobody actually reads. He was 38, built like a man who paid someone else to build him that way, with a laugh that filled a room before you'd even heard the joke. Everybody loved Marcus at first. Everybody except my dog, Sarge, who growled low in his throat the very first time Marcus walked through my front door, and I've learned over the years that dogs and old sailors read a room the same way. By what a man does when he thinks nobody's watching. The first year, for scraps of love, I saw nothing but a young couple building. Claire had always been soft-hearted, gentle the way her mother was gentle, and I told myself Marcus's confidence balanced that out. Opposites, people say. I believed it because I wanted to. The cracks started small the way they always do. Christmas at my house, 2nd year of the marriage. Claire had spent the whole afternoon making her mother's cornbread dressing from a recipe card stained with 20 years of use. It came out a little dry, nothing tragic, just dry, and Marcus took one bite in front of my sister and her husband and said, "Loud enough for the whole table. Well, good thing you're pretty, babe, because Julia, child, you are not." The table laughed the nervous laugh people give when they don't know what else to do. Claire laughed too, but I watched her shoulders climb up toward her ears like she was bracing for something, and I've spent enough years reading Men Under Fire to know that a body doesn't flinch like that from one bad joke. A body flinches like that from practice. I started watching closer after that, the way you watch a tree line when something feels wrong even though you can't say what yet. Easter. He mocked the dress she'd bought for the occasion, said it made her look like she was trying too hard for a woman her age. At her cousin's wedding, he corrected every story she told at the table. "That's not how it happened, babe." 10 years of begging for scraps of love, you always get the details backwards, until she stopped telling stories at all. By the 3rd year, Claire had gone quiet, and where she used to be the one who kept conversation moving, that silence should have told me everything. I let myself believe it was just marriage settling. There was a night in early spring, a cookout I threw in my backyard for no particular reason, except that Sarge needed the exercise and I needed the company. A few of my old Navy buddies came, a couple of neighbors, Claire and Marcus. Marcus had been drinking bourbon since before he arrived. Scraps of loves, and I could smell it under his cologne when he clapped me on the shoulder near the grill. "You know what gets me about you, Tom," he said, loud enough for the yard to hear, "is how quiet you are about the whole military thing. Every other old vet I meet, you barely say a word." For scraps of love. "Nothing much to say," I told him, flipping a burger. "Come on, 31 years and nothing to say? What'd you even do, push paper?" A couple of the neighbors chuckled. My old teammate Otis Grant, a retired county deputy who'd known me since before Mary Ann and I married, went very still beside the cooler. For scraps of love, he didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Otis knew exactly what 31 years had actually held because he was one of maybe 4 people alive who did. Marcus kept going, feeding off the silence like men like him always do. I think half of you old-timers exaggerate the whole thing anyway. For scraps of love, make yourself sound tougher than you were. He grinned at Claire like he expected her to laugh along. She didn't laugh. She looked at her plate, and when she came inside a few minutes later to help me carry out the corn, of begging for scraps of love, I caught sight of something on her wrist before she tugged her sleeve down over it, a bruise, pale green, fading to yellow at the edges, the kind that's a week old, not a day. "Claire," I said quietly, "it's nothing, Dad." She wouldn't look at me. "Claire, please," she whispered. And that single word did something to my chest that 31 years of gunfire never managed. Please, not annoyed, not defensive. Afraid. That night, after everyone left, I sat alone in my garage with Sarge's head resting on my boot and pulled a small wooden case down from a shelf I hadn't touched since Mary Ann's funeral. Inside was the last piece of a promise I'd made my daughter when she was 18 years old and about to leave for her first semester away at college. Love, back when the world felt bigger and more dangerous to a father than it probably needed to. Taught her a simple system back then. Nothing elaborate, nothing a teenager couldn't remember under pressure. If she ever texted me something ordinary followed by a 6-digit number, and that number started with the digits 256. It meant one thing and one thing only. I need you now, and I can't say why out loud. Come, don't call first, don't ask questions. Just come. She'd rolled her eyes at me the day I taught her that code. Dad, you've been watching too many movies. Maybe I had. Of begging for scraps of love. Or maybe a father who has buried more young people than he can count learns to prepare for the worst in ways his daughter finds embarrassing right up until the night it saves her life. I didn't hear from that code for 11 years. I'd started to think she'd forgotten it entirely. For scraps of love. Filed it away with trainings and curfews, one more relic of a childhood she'd outgrown. I was wrong about that, too. It came on a Thursday night in October, 9:40 in the evening, rain hammering the tin roof of my garage hard enough that I almost missed the buzz of my phone on the workbench. A text from Claire, Dad, do you still have Mom's peach pie recipe? I need it for something underneath. No explanation, no punctuation. Just 6 numbers, 256417. My hands went cold before my mind had even finished processing what I was looking at. 256, the code. 417 meant location confirmed, active danger, do not wait for confirmation. I had built that phrase with her at a kitchen table 9 years ago, half joking, half terrified father teaching his daughter to survive a world he'd seen too much of. I never imagined I would be the one receiving it. I stood up so fast, the stool clattered backward onto the concrete floor. Sarge was already on his feet, ears up, reading my body before I'd said a word. I didn't think about Marcus's name, didn't think about calling Claire back to ask questions I already knew the answers to. Begging for scraps of love. 31 years of training folded itself over my grief and my fear, and it always had in the field. Not loud, not frantic, just a terrible focus calm settling into my bones like cold water finding its level. I grabbed my truck keys off the hook by the door. I did not grab anything else. Whatever was happening at my daughter's house, I told myself, walking fast through the rain toward my old Ford, I was going to handle it the way I'd handled every crisis in 3 decades of service, with control, not rage. Rage gets people killed, control gets them home. Of begging for scraps of love. I called 911 from the truck, the dispatcher's already turning over. The dispatcher's voice was young, steady. Possible domestic assault in progress, I said, pulling out of the driveway into sheeting rain. My daughter's residence, 214 Marsh Hollow Road. Scraps of, I'm her father. I'm Barut now. Sir, I need you to wait for officers to arrive. Do you understand? Do not enter the residence. I understand, I said, which was true. I understood the instruction perfectly. I simply had no intention of following it, and something in my voice must have told her that. Because there was a pause in the line before she asked carefully, Sir, are you armed? There's a firearm locked in my vehicle. I have no intention of using it unless my daughter's life depends on it. That part was the truth, every word of it. People who have never worn a uniform imagine old veterans are eager for a fight. Most of us spend the rest of our lives trying to avoid becoming the men we had to be overseas. Officers are 6 minutes out, the dispatcher said. Understood, I said again, and hung up before she could argue further. For scraps of love, because I already knew 6 minutes might be 5 minutes too many. The drive to Marsh Hollow Road takes 11 minutes in good weather. I made it in 7, hydroplaning twice through standing water on the low bridge over Coulter Creek. For scraps of love, cutting twin tunnels through rain that fell sideways in the wind. My knees ached the way they always do in weather like this, 67 years old, a lifetime of hard landings finally sending its bill, but I barely felt it. There's a version of a man that wakes up when someone he loves is in danger, and that version doesn't feel much of anything except the next necessary movement. Claire and Marcus's house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac lined with half-grown live oaks, so scraps of love. The kind of quiet suburban street where nothing bad is supposed to happen and everything bad eventually does. Every downstairs light in the house was blazing. I could hear him before I even opened the truck door. Marcus's voice raised and slurred, carrying out into the storm. For scraps of love. I crossed the yard low and fast despite my knees, the old instincts taking over the mechanics of movement the way muscle memory always does, no matter how many years have passed since it mattered. Through the kitchen window, lit up gold against the black rain, I saw my daughter backed against the counter. Scraps of love. One raised in front of her face, blood at the corner of her mouth, broken glass scattered across the tile floor around her bare feet. Something inside me went very still. Not angry, that surprises people when I tell it, but it's the truth. Anger is loud, and loud gets people killed. Scraps of. What I felt standing in that rain was something older and colder than anger. It was the same stillness I'd felt exactly twice before in my life, both times right before I did something I could never fully take back. I moved toward the side gate. I stepped over the low hedge separating the side yard from the patio, rain running cold down the back of my collar, and found the sliding cold down the back of my collar, and found the sliding door standing half open, curtains snapping softly in the wind. Inside, your father's some kind of hero? For scraps of love, he's a broke old man who talks to his dog more than he talks to people. Nobody's coming to save you, Claire. I stepped through the door without a sound. 26 years of moving through hostile spaces teaches a body how to cross a floor without announcing itself, even a floor it's never walked before. For scraps of love, even at 67 with knees that ache in the cold. Marcus didn't see me. Claire did. Her eyes went wide over his shoulder, and for one terrible second I watched her decide whether to warn him or stay silent. The old habit of protecting her abuser, fighting against the part of her resent that heads me that code in the first place. Dad, she breathed. Marcus spun around, and for one absurd moment, his face broke into something like relief, as of begging for scraps of love, like he expected me to be an ally against whatever he imagined the real threat was. Then he registered the look on my face, and the relief curdled into something uglier. Well, look who it is, he slurred. Step away from her, I said. For scraps of love. My voice came out quieter than I expected. Calm, almost gentle. That unsettled him more than shouting would have. Or what, old man from my daughter Marcus? This is the only time I'm going to ask. He laughed, but it had a crack in it now. Of love. The first thread of fear working its way through the bravado. You know what your problem is? Everybody in this family treats you like you're some kind of legend, and you're nothing. You're a lonely old man in a garage full of junk nobody wants. I didn't answer him. Men like Marcus feed on reaction the way a fire feeds on wind, and I had spent 3 decades learning to starve exactly that kind of fire. He took 2 steps toward me instead, chin jutting forward, begging for scraps of love. Right shoulder dropping the way a man's shoulder drops right before he throws a punch he's never actually thrown in his life. I redirected his arm before the punch finished forming, turned with his own momentum, and put him face down on the kitchen tile among the broken glass before he understood what had happened to him. I pinned his wrist behind his back, controlled pressure. Nothing that would break anything, just enough to keep him exactly where he was. Stop resisting, I said, and adjusted the pressure slightly when he tried to buck upward. He gasped and went still. Pain compliance hunts is as precise as many times when you've done it as many times as I have. It isn't about making resistance not worth the cost. You're hurting me, he shouted. You're not hurt, I said. 10 begging for scraps of love. There's a difference, and you're about to have a lot of time to think about it. Claire had sunk down against the cabinets, one hand pressed to her split lip, crying the 11 years of silence finally break open all at once. I kept my eyes on Marcus and my knee steady against his shoulder blade, and 30 seconds later red and blue light swept across the kitchen windows. 2 deputies came through the front door with weapons drawn, and I raised one hand slowly, keeping the other locked on Marcus's wrist. Victim secure. Scraps of suspect restrained. I'm the one who called it in. The older deputy, a heavy-set man in his 50s with a graying mustache, looked at the way I had Marcus pinned, looked at my breathing, which hadn't changed, looked at the calm in my face that had nothing to do with what should have been an adrenaline-soaked moment. Something passed behind his eyes, the particular recognition one professional gives another. Sir, he said, were you ever in the service? Retired Navy, I said. I didn't say special warfare. I didn't say the things I never say. Some truths you carry quietly your whole life, and this wasn't a moment to set them down. He nodded once, like that single fact explained everything he needed explained, and motioned the younger deputy forward. Cuff him. Marcus twisted his head to glare up at me from the floor, mascara of rage and humiliation all over his face. This is assault. I want him arrested. He attacked me in my own house. Nobody looked at him. The older deputy crouched instead in front of Claire, voice gone soft in a way that told me he'd done this exact thing more times than he'd probably wanted to. Ma'am, are you hurt? Claire's voice when it came was barely a whisper. Yes, that single word rearranged the entire room. Of begging for scraps of love. The younger deputy read Marcus' rights over the top of his furious protests, hauled him to his feet, and walked him out into the rain toward the cruiser while he screamed something about lawyers and lawsuits that nobody in that kitchen had the slightest interest in hearing. I found a throw blanket folded over the back of a chair and wrapped it around Claire's shoulders the same way I used to after summer thunderstorms scared her as a little girl back when the only monsters in her life lived in closets and under beds. You're safe now, I told her. I've got you. Begging for scraps of love. She grabbed a fistful of my shirt and cried into my shoulder the way she hadn't cried in front of me since her mother's funeral, and somewhere underneath my own relief that she was alive, a colder thought was already forming, the thought that would keep me awake most nights for the next several weeks. For scraps of love. I should have seen this sooner. I had spent 3 decades learning to read danger in strangers on the other side of the world, and I had somehow missed it living under my own family's roof. The older deputy came to stand beside me while the EMTs looked Claire over on the porch. Of begging for scraps of love. You handled that about as clean as I've seen, he said quietly. Most people panic. You didn't even raise your voice. Panic doesn't help anybody, I said. He studied me a moment longer than was comfortable. You didn't strike him. Not once. I watched the whole thing from the doorway. Wasn't trying to hurt him, I said, was trying to stop him. He nodded slowly, like he was filing that distinction away somewhere important. That matters more than you probably realized, Mr. Reyes. That's going to matter a lot going forward. He was right, of begging for scraps of love. Though I wouldn't understand exactly how right for several more weeks, Claire came to stay with me that night, and for the first several days afterward, we moved around each other like two people who'd survived the same explosion and weren't sure yet how much of themselves had made it out intact. She slept in her old bedroom, the one I'd never gotten around to changing after she left for college. Faded soccer trophies still lined up on the dresser, a poster of a boy band she'd have died of embarrassment over if I ever mentioned it now. Some part of me, I think, begging for scraps of love, had kept that room exactly the same all these years, hoping she'd need to come home to it someday. I just never wanted the reason to be this one. The first morning, I woke before dawn out of old habit and found her already at the kitchen table when I came down, wrapped in one of my old navy sweatshirts, staring into a cup of coffee she wasn't drinking. Her lip looked worse in daylight than it had the night before, swollen, a thin, dark line of stitches at the corner where the ear doctor had closed the split. Seeing it in full morning light did something to my chest I don't have good words for even now. "Slove, I'm sorry, Dad," she said without looking up. "For what exactly?" For all of it. For not telling you sooner. For making you drive out there in that part." I sat down across from her slowly, the way you approach something wounded and skittish. "Be for scraps of love, careful not to move too fast. Claire, you don't owe me an apology, not one word of one." Her eyes filled immediately and she looked away toward the window. "I should have left him a year ago. Maybe longer. Maybe," I said honestly, because pretending otherwise wouldn't have helped either of us. But fear keeps people in rooms they should have walked out of a long time ago. That's not weakness, sweetheart. That's just what fear does to a person. No matter how smart is to a person, no matter how smart or quiet a long moment, turning the coffee cup slowly between her hands, then, so softly, Laz. I almost missed it. I didn't want you to think I'd failed. I don't know how to explain what that sentence did to a man who had survived firefights and funerals and 31 years of things I still don't say out loud. It went in clean, straight through whatever armor I thought I still had left. Because the truth underneath it was one I had to own to. Some of that fear she carried I had planted myself years before Marcus ever walked through my door. A father who went quiet after his wife died instead of staying present for the daughter who still needed him. Scraps of love, who taught himself that stoic silence was strength instead of teaching her that asking for help was too. "I owe you an apology of my own," I said finally. "After your mother died, I disappeared into myself instead of staying present for you. I taught you that a person handles pain alone, quietly, love, without asking anyone to carry any of it with them. That was the wrong lesson, Claire, and I think some part of you carried that lesson right into your marriage." She looked at me then, really looked, in a way she hadn't in years. "I never blamed you for that. Maybe you should have," I said. "A little? 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Anyway, it might have made this easier to see coming." We sat in that admission softly against the windows from the tail end of the storm, and something between us shifted that morning. Not fixed, not finished, but finally, honestly, begun. Over the following days, in pieces at her own pace, Claire told me the rest of it. How Marcus had been different in the beginning, charming, generous, attentive in a way that made her feel like the only person in any room he walked into. How the small criticisms had crept in slowly after the wedding, begging for scraps of one at a time, so gradual she'd never noticed the floor tilting under her until she was already standing at the bottom of something she couldn't climb back out of alone. How the first time he'd grabbed her hard enough to bruise, he'd wept afterward, blamed the stress of the dealership for scraps of love, promised it would never happen again, and how she had believed him because believing him was easier, he always admitting what she'd like he meant it. She said one evening on the back porch, wrapped in a blanket, watching the marsh grass move in the wind. Every single time. And every time I thought maybe this was the last time. That's the pattern, I told her. Apology, excuse, a little kindness to make you doubt yourself, then it happens again. It's not an accident that it works that way. It's designed to work that way. The man doing it even realizes he's doing it or not. She wiped her eyes with the back of her sleeve. I used to think if I just got better at managing him, cooked dinner exactly on time, didn't disagree with him in front of people, things would go back to how they were at the beginning. I know now that was never how it worked. But knowing it and believing it in your body are two different things, Dad. I understood that better than she realized. Combat teaches you the same cruel lesson, knowing a threat exists and actually letting your body believe it deep down for scraps of love. One afternoon, entire old friend Otis Grant came by with a casserole his wife had made and stayed for coffee on the porch. Otis had retired from the county sheriff's department 11 years earlier after a bullet took part of his hip in a routine traffic stop that went sideways, and he still moved with a slight hitch in his step that he claimed kept him humble. He and I had known each other since before either of our wives, back when we were both young men who thought we understood the world. Heard about the trouble at Claire's place, he said, settling into the porch chair across from me with a grunt. "County boys still talk about you in the break room, you know. Retired vet disarmed a man twice his size without landing a single blow. Deputy Halston can't stop talking about it. Wasn't trying to make a name for myself, Otis. I know that." He sipped his coffee, watching the marsh the same way I did, the two of us comfortable in silence the way old friends often are. Just telling you it matters is all. Judges and juries, they pay attention to how a man acts under pressure. You keeping your head like that instead of beating that boy senseless, that's going to carry weight when this goes to court. Real weight. I wasn't thinking about court, Otis. I was thinking about getting my daughter out of that house alive. I know that too, he said. Doesn't change what I said. Otis had a way of saying things plainly that made them easier to hear, and over the following weeks, as the legal process ground forward with the particular slowness of a small-town court system, he became something like an anchor for both Claire and me, a steady, sensible voice reminding us that the system, imperfect as it was, existed for exactly a situation like this one, and that patience, however hard one, would serve us better than rage. It was Detective Sarah Bennett, a sharp-eyed woman in her mid-40s assigned to the case for scraps of love, who first told me about the financial piece, the part of Marcus's cruelty that had nothing to do with bruises. She sat at my kitchen table 2 weeks after the arrest, laptop open, expression carefully neutral in the way of someone who'd delivered hard news for a living long enough to master her own face. We pulled financial records as part of the investigation, she said. Claire, did you know your joint investment account, the one your father set up for you after your mother passed, has lost most of its balance over the past 2 years? Claire went pale. That account was for emergency, begging for scraps of love. I never touch it. Your husband did, Detective Bennett said gently. Repeatedly. We're talking close to $80,000 moved out over 18 months, mostly into what looks like a personal trading account that's currently underwater. There's also a second mortgage on the house you didn't co-sign for scraps of love, taken out using a forged authorization. The room went very quiet. $80,000. Marianne's life insurance, the money I'd set aside so carefully, so deliberately, meant to be Claire's safety net if the world ever turned on her the way it eventually had gone. Scraps of love, fed into whatever hole in Marcus Whitfield's ego required constant, expensive feeding. There's something else, Claire said quietly and reached into her purse with hands that were shaking. She pulled out a small USB drive, scuffed at the edges, like it had been carried and hidden for a long time. I started recording some of our arguments about 8 months ago on my phone. Then I'd transfer them here. I didn't know what I was going to do with them. I just knew I needed proof that I wasn't imagining things. Detective Bennett plugged the drive into her laptop without a word. For scraps of love, the first file was only 40 seconds long, but 40 seconds was enough. Marcus's voice raised and slurred, glass breaking somewhere in the background, Claire's voice small and frightened underneath it, and then, near the end, one sentence that turned my blood to ice water. If your father ever gets involved, for scraps of love, I swear to God I will make sure that old man regrets it. Detective Bennett closed the laptop slowly. Well, she said, in the careful tone of someone delivering good news wrapped inside terrible news, that's going to help your case considerably, Claire. Claire looked down at her hands, ashamed all over again. I felt it like a criminal, recording him, like I was doing something wrong. You weren't doing anything wrong, the detective said, firm now. Surviving a situation like that however you can isn't wrong. Don't let anyone, including yourself, ever tell you it was. That night, after Detective Bennett left, I found myself sitting alone in my garage for a long time, the same wooden bench where I'd once kept a small case for a code I'd hoped my daughter would never have to use. I thought about the $80,000 Marianne's death had left behind, meant to protect Claire, quietly bled dry by none of us had seen clearly until it was almost too late. I thought about the words on that recording, I will make sure that old man regrets it, and understood with a clarity that settled cold and certain in my chest exactly what kind of man Marcus Whitfield actually was underneath the expensive haircut and the showroom charm. He wasn't simply cruel by accident. He was afraid, in his own twisted way, afraid of being seen as small. The way I would later learn he'd been raised by a father who'd lost everything twice over and taken his own failures out on a boy who grew up promising himself he would never again be the poorest kid in any room. That fear had curdled into something that needed control the way other men need air, begging for scraps of love, needed Claire smaller so he could feel larger, needed her savings drained so he could feel like the success he'd always performed being. It didn't excuse a single bruise on my daughter's body, but it explained the shape of the thing, of begging for scraps of love, and understanding the shape of a threat is something 31 years in uniform had taught me never to skip, no matter how much easier it would have been to simply call him a monster and leave it there. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for the first week of November, and it was there, begging for scraps of love, in a courtroom Claire could barely walk into without her hands shaking, that the second and far more public reckoning was waiting for all of us. Gray clouds hung low over the coastal courthouse that morning, the kind of damp Georgia chill that finds its way into old joints and stays there. Claire sat beside me in the hallway outside the courtroom, gripping a paper coffee cup with both hands like it was the only warm, solid thing in the world. She looked healthier than she had a month earlier, color back in her cheeks, the stitches at her lip finally dissolved. For scraps of love, leaving only a thin, pale line that would fade further with time. But fragile still lived underneath the surface of her, the way it does after something breaks and starts slowly to knit here for this part, I told her. Detective Bennett said the evidence speaks for itself. I need to be here, she said. I need him to see my face when I tell the truth. I understood that better than most fathers would. Of begging for scraps of love. There's a kind of healing that only happens when a person stops hiding from the thing that hurt them and looks it dead in the eye instead. Inside the courtroom, Marcus looked smaller than I remembered him. Not physically, though the county lockup had clearly stripped some of the gym-built bulk from his frame, but smaller in the way confidence deflates once consequences finally arrive at the door and refuse to leave. His expensive suits were gone, replaced by an ill-fitting jacket his lawyer had probably rented for the occasion. His hair, always so carefully styled, hung flat and unwashed. For scraps of love. When he spotted Claire and me walking in together, his jaw tightened into something ugly, and for just a moment, before he remembered to arrange his face into wounded innocence for the jury pool watching from the gallery, I saw exactly what my daughter had been living with for 3 years. His attorney, for scraps of love, a slick younger man with a Charleston cement and a watch that morphed in my truck, stood and painted a familiar picture. Provider, a hard-working husband, pushed past his limits by a marriage under financial strain, a man who deserved compassion, not condemnation. Then he turned toward me, scraps of love, and Mr. Reyes, the attorney continued, voice dripping with theatrical concern, a man who took the law into his own hands, a man who assaulted my client in his own home. I sat perfectly still, hands folded on the table in front of me, for scraps of love, and let the accusation hang there in the courtroom air. Evidence doesn't care about performance, and I'd learned a long time ago that a calm face unsettles a room far more effectively than an angry one. The prosecutor, a compact woman named Denise Alvarez with tired eyes and efficient manner, 10 years of begging for scrap with the theater, she simply began presenting what the evidence actually showed. Photographs of Claire's injuries, time-stamped and clinical, medical records from 3 separate emergency room visits over 18 months, scraps of love, each one logged under increasingly implausible explanations. A fall down the stairs, a kitchen accident, a slip on wet tile, financial statements detailing the slow, methodical draining of the account meant to protect Claire's future, and then finally body camera footage from Deputy Halston's uniform, playing across a screen mounted at the front of the courtroom for the whole gallery to see. There I was, on that grainy footage, exactly as it had happened, calm, controlled, restraining Marcus without a single strike, landed, my voice even and quiet through the entire exchange. No shouting, no rage, just the methodical containment of a threat, captured in real time for anyone in that room who still wanted to believe I'd been the at-room. Instead, it played the second half of the footage. Marcus, drunk and furious, screaming threats while Claire cried against the counter with blood on her chin. Of begging for scraps of love. I watched the defense attorney's confidence visibly drain out of him as the footage played, but Marcus wasn't finished humiliating himself yet when his attorney called him to the stand against what I later learned was Detective Bennett's private prediction that he would. Marcus took the oath and proceeded to blame everyone in that courtroom except the one person responsible, the alcohol, the stress of the dealership, Claire's supposed emotional volatility, and then directly at me for scraps the room. With a sneer that told me exactly how little he'd learned in 6 weeks of lockup, he said the thing that finally broke something loose in my daughter. He turned her against me, poisoned her mind against her own husband. For scraps of love, that old man's been jealous of what we had since the day I walked into his life. I felt Claire straighten beside me before the prosecutor had even finished her next question. She stood on her own without being called, voice shaking at first and then growing steadier with every word. A 10 years but smags of the way a fire catches once it finds it to the back air. No, she said loud enough to carry to the back row. My saved my life. The courtroom went utterly silent. For 3 years, Claire continued. I told myself I was the problem, that if I just managed you better, cooked dinner on time, didn't disagree with you in front of people, things would go back to how they were in the beginning. I stopped calling my own friends because you didn't like them. I stopped visiting my father because every time I came home with a bruise I couldn't explain, I was terrified he'd see it. For scraps of love. I lost $80,000 of money my mother left behind for me, and I didn't even notice because you convinced me I wasn't smart enough to manage my own finances. Her voice cracked, but she didn't sit down. I stopped recognizing myself somewhere in that marriage, Marcus. I don't even know who that woman was anymore, the one who apologized to you for bleeding on your kitchen floor. Several jurors in the gallery had tears on their faces by the time she finished. An older woman in the second row pressed a tissue to her mouth. Even the judge, scraps of love, a stern woman who had clearly presided over more of these cases than any person should have to, allowed herself a long, heavy pause before calling for order. During the recess that followed, Detective Bennett found me near the hallway vending machines, 2 coffees in hand, and passed one to me without asking if I wanted it. Special warfare, she said. It wasn't a question. I raised an eyebrow. How'd you know that? The restraint in that footage. Most people, even trained officers, tense up when they're controlling a resisting subject. You didn't tense once. It's of begging for scraps of love. That's not police training. That's something else entirely. She sipped her coffee. My husband served 2 tours with a SEAL platoon out of Norfolk. I've seen that particular kind of stillness exactly one other time in my life. I didn't confirm or deny it. Some things carries quietly his whole life, and a courthouse hallway wasn't the place to set that particular one down. For what it's worth, she added, the way you handled yourself that night probably did more for this case than anything in the financial records. If you'd lost your temper and beaten him the way most fathers would have wanted to, the defense would have spent the whole trial making this about you instead of about what he did to her. I wasn't thinking about the trial, I told her honestly. I was thinking about getting my daughter out of that kitchen. I know, she said. That's exactly why it worked. The judge handed down her ruling on the sentencing 6 weeks later on the sentencing in early December on a morning cold enough that frost had settled on the marsh grass outside the courthouse for the first time that season. Claire almost didn't come. She told me the night before that she wasn't sure she had the strength to sit in the same room with him one more time, to hear his voice, to watch him perform remorse or defiance or whatever mask he'd chosen to wear that day. I told her the choice was hers entirely, and I meant. But that morning, of begging for scraps of love, she was dressed and waiting at finished my coffee, just set in a way that it reminded him with a sudden ache of her mother. I need to see it through, she said, all the way through. That morning, before we left, I climbed up into my attic for the first time in longer than I wanted to admit and pulled down an old garment bag that still smelled faintly of cedar uniform, pressed and preserved the way Marianne had always kept it, scraps of love. Back when she loved seeing me in it more than I ever loved wearing it myself. I hadn't put it on since her funeral 12 years earlier, when I'd worn only the jacket because she'd once told me it reminded her that underneath all my quiet, there was still a man who'd once carried himself with something like pride. I pinned the ribbons back onto the chest one by one, my hands steadier than I expected them to be, though my chest was doing something complicated the entire time. A silver star I'd never once talked about at any dinner table in my life. A purple heart from a mission I still don't discuss, even with Otis. Medals don't bring back the men who didn't make it home, and I'd never much cared for the ceremony of wearing them. But some mornings call for armor of a different kind than the kind you wear into a firefight, and that particular December morning I understood I needed all the parts of me I had spent a decade keeping folded away in an attic, out of sight, out of use. Scraps of love. For Scraps' uniform, Claire stood very still in the kitchen doorway, staring at me like she was seeing the kitchen doorway, staring at me like she was seeing a stranger face. You never wear that, she said quietly. I know, you look different. Maybe you're just finally seeing all of it. I told her, and she reached out and straightened my collar the way her mother used to, a small gesture that undid something tender in my chest. And inside the courtroom, the moment Marcus caught sight of me in that uniform, something shifted visibly behind his eyes, not the arrogance I'd grown used to seeing for Scraps of love, but something closer to genuine fear, the particular fear of a man who has just understood, all at once and far too late, he'd spent 3 years mocking person barbecues. The judge reviewed the full record in silence for what felt like a very long time. The photographs, the financial statements, the recordings, the body camera footage, Claire's testimony, my own brief statement to Detective Bennett weeks earlier. When she finally looked up, she asked whether either party wished to address the court before sentencing was handed down. Marcus's attorney rose first for Scraps of love, offering another round of the same stress, alcohol, a man who deserved a second chance to make things right. Then the judge turned to me, Mr. Reyes. You've been named repeatedly in this proceeding. Would you like to speak? I stood slowly. 67 years old. Dress, uniform pressing tight across shoulders that had carried more than their fair share over the decades. Every joint in my body reminding me I was no longer the young man who'd hence put that uniform on, but my voice came out steady. I spent 31 years around violence, I began. Real violence. War. Loss. Things I don't discuss at dinner tables because civilians shouldn't have to carry what soldiers carry. And in all that time, I learned exactly one thing worth repeating in a room like this one. I glanced briefly toward Marcus, who wouldn't meet my eyes. For Scraps of love, strength has nothing to do with making the people who love you afraid of you, nothing at all. A few people in the gallery lowered their heads. Claire's hand found mine and gripped it. Real strength, I continued, is protecting the people who can't protect themselves in the moment they need it most. It's staying calm when rage would be easier feel for about 30 seconds, a lot more satisfying. It's choosing accountability over destruction, even when destruction is sitting right there, tempting you. I paused. I don't hate Marcus Whitfield. I hate what he did to my daughter. It's of begging for scraps of love, and I hate the 3 years of her life he stole while convincing her it was somehow her own fault. But hatred is a debt that keeps compounding interest on the person carrying it. Years of begging for scraps of love, and I've buried enough good men to know I'm not interested in paying that particular bill for the rest of whatever years I've got left. I looked directly at the judge. I'm asking this court for accountability, not destruction. There's a difference, and I think it matters. begging for scraps of love. The judge listened without interrupting, then handed down her ruling: 4 years in state custody, mandatory alcohol treatment, court-ordered domestic violence intervention, full restitution of the $80,000 plus interest for scraps of love, and a permanent restraining order protecting Claire for the remainder of both their lives. As deputies moved to lead him out, Marcus stopped near the exit and turned him. The tears on his face looked nothing like performance. "I'm sorry," he said. So quietly I almost missed it. Claire didn't answer him. She simply held my hand a little tighter and watched him disappear through the courtroom doors, and I felt something in her posture change beside me. Not relief exactly, something quieter and more permanent than relief. Begging for scraps of love, the particular stillness of a person who finally, after a very long time, winter moved slowly that year, the way healing generally does once you're past a certain age and have learned not to expect anything to happen quickly anymore. By February, the frost had finally given way to soft mornings along the marsh, and Claire began, piece by piece, rebuilding a life entirely her own. She found a small apartment above a bakery downtown, begging for scraps of love, owned by a widow named Rosalind who kept the ovens running before dawn and never once asked Claire questions she wasn't ready to answer. The apartment wasn't large, but morning light poured across the kitchen table, and after everything, Claire told me once, for scraps of love. Quiet spaces filled with sunlight had become the most beautiful thing she knew. She went back to work part-time at the county library, nervous at first that people would whisper about the trial, which had made the local paper twice. Instead, she found something she hadn't expected: a town full of people, many of them women her mother's age or older, who recognized the particular exhaustion behind her eyes because they'd carried some version of it themselves. Small towns surprise you sometimes, in either direction. I thought everyone would judge me for staying as long as I did. She admitted to me one afternoon over coffee at my kitchen table. Most people who've lived long enough have survived something they're ashamed of, I told her. That tends to make people gentler, not harsher, once they recognize it in somebody else. I still feel embarrassed sometimes, she said, for scraps of love. That feeling might stick around a while yet, I told her honestly, but shame loses its grip a little more every time you say the truth a little more loud instead of carrying it alone. Your mother used to tell me that. It took me most of my life to actually believe it. As for me, the case had cracked something open that I hadn't realized had been sealed shut for almost a decade. I'd spent the years since Marianne's death mistaking isolation for peace, filling my days with small solitary repairs, a leaking gutter here for scraps of love, a neighbor's dock railing there, anything that let me avoid sitting still long enough to feel the size of the silence in my own house. Otis finally talked me into joining the Wednesday breakfast crowd at the VFW hall that spring for scraps of love, something I'd resisted for years out of some stubborn notion that my particular memories didn't belong at a table with other men's memories. Turns out old veterans don't spend their mornings reliving old battles the way movies suggest. Mostly we talk about grandchildren, blood pressure medication, 10 years of engines that won't turn over, and whichever one of us lost the most at cards the week before. Curtis Dabney, a retired Marine gunnery sergeant with a laugh you could hear across the parking lot, told me one morning that I seemed lighter than he remembered. I thought about that the whole drive home. Scraps of love. Lighter wasn't exactly the word I'd have chosen, but something had shifted. Some old weight finally set down after being carried for far longer than necessary. That spring, Claire brought my grandson Ezra over for Sunday dinner, 9 years old, missing one front tooth, for scraps of love, endlessly curious about everything that moved. Marcus had rarely allowed him to visit alone during the marriage, some vague complaint about my being too old-fashioned for a growing boy to spend unsupervised time around. Now Ezra ran through my backyard like he'd been let loose from a cage, Sarge barking happily at his heels, and I watched my daughter laugh, really laugh, the kind that reaches the eyes. For the first time in longer than either of us went to it that afternoon, we sat by the edge of the marsh, fish acting lines cast out into still water while dragonflies skimmed the surface, and Ezra studied me with the particular seriousness only children manage to pull off. Mom said you were in the Navy, he said. That's right. Like a regular sailor Navy? I smiled. Something like that. Mom said you took Marcus down like a superhero. I nearly choked on my own laugh. For scraps of love. Your mother exaggerates. She really doesn't, he said, with the flat certainty only a 9-year-old can manage. We fished in comfortable silence for a while after that, until Ezra finally asked the question I'd been quietly waiting for since the day he arrived. For scraps of love, the question every child eventually finds their way to asking, why was he so mean to Mom? I turned the question over carefully before answering, choosing words the way you choose your footing on wet rock. Sometimes people carry a kind of fear inside them they never learned how to handle, I told him. And instead of dealing with that scrap honestly, they try to make themselves feel bigger by making the people around them feel smaller. It's a bad way to live, and it hurts everybody it touches, including, eventually, the person doing it. Ezra frowned, working through that with the whole of his 9-year-old seriousness. Did he hate Mom? No, I said, and that was somehow the saddest part of the whole answer. I don't think he did. I think he loved her about as well as he knew how, which wasn't nearly well enough. He was quiet a moment, 10 years of begging for on the still water, watching his bobber drift on the still cold, the kind of thing children say without understanding the full weight of it, that adults spend entire lifetimes failing to articulate half as clearly. That's not love, though, Ezra said. Scraps of love. Real love doesn't need somebody to be scared of you. I didn't trust my voice to answer him right away. I just reached over and handed him the net for the small bream he'd hooked and let the boy's plain, unadorned wisdom settle into the quiet part of me that still needed to hear it. Dench. There was one more piece to close, one loose thread from a promise made a long time ago. The evening Claire moved the last of her things into her new apartment, I drove her over myself. Scraps of love. Truck bed loaded with boxes and one particular item I'd kept wrapped in an old dish towel since she was 16. A small brass compass that had belonged to my own father, the one I'd given her the same summer I taught her the distress code back when she'd rolled her eyes at both gifts in the exact same breath. If you're ever lost, I told her again now, the same words I'd used all those years ago, pressing the compass into her palm, this point's home. Doesn't matter how far off course you've drifted. It always finds true north eventually. She turned it over in her hands, running her thumb across the worn brass casing, and I watched something settle in her face, not the fear I'd grown so used to seeing there over the past 3 years, steadier. For scraps of love, something closer to the daughter I remembered from before the world had tried so hard to convince her she was smaller than she actually was. I kept the code memorized this whole time, she said quietly, even after I stopped believing anybody was really listening. I was always listening, I told her. For scraps of love, every single day. That's not going to change, Claire, no matter how old either of us gets. She hugged me tight in the doorway of her new apartment, sunlight from the bakery windows spilling gold across the floor between us, and for the first time in longer than either of us could properly measure, scraps love. The fear that had lived so long behind her eyes was finally, completely gone. I drove home that evening along the marsh road in the last of the daylight, windows down, the smell of salt marsh and low tide drifting through the cab the way it had every evening of my whole life in this town. For scraps of love, I thought about 31 years of service, about the men I'd buried and the ones I'd brought home, about a wife who'd taught me more about quiet strength than any training command ever managed, and I thought about a 9-year-old boy who'd understood in 6 plain words. For scraps of love, something it had taken his grandfather nearly 70 years to fully believe. Real love doesn't need somebody to be scared of you. If you've ever protected someone you love, if you've ever carried silence for longer than you should have, if you've ever needed someone to simply show up when you finally found the courage to ask, I hope this reminded you that it's never too late, not to ask for help, not to offer it, and never too late to choose peace over pride and love over fear, no matter how many years it takes you to finally learn the difference.